And now we get to the second part of our little CC double bill on recent Greek mythology outings with Immortals, which came out just a year later, after Clash of the Titans unceremoniously was dumped on us, and a year before we were made to endure Wrath of the Titans. So how does this one stand up? After all, this one has a very different creative team headed up by Tarsem Singh, and it actually comes from the producers of Zack Snyder and Frank Miller's 300. So you would think, okay, maybe this one has a chance to actually show some pedigree and have some qualities, right? Well, after viewing it, I'm kinda now torn as to whether or not I dislike it more or less than Clash of the Titans. What's so infuriating about Immortals is that on the one hand you can tell a lot more effort and thought went into this than compared to Clash and Wrath. For one thing, Tarsem Singh, if for nothing else, is definitely one of the most distinct visual filmmakers of his generation. He's about as close to a painter on a film screen as you're really going to get among mainstream filmmakers. The use of color, the costumes, sets, CGI, the composition and the shots of how buildings and characters are framed. There is a meticulous eye to detail on a visual level here that is certainly impressive. Anyone who's interested in the more visual end of filmmaking, like cinematography or set design or colorization, needs to definitely consider giving Immortals a whirl, because on that level it actually looks great. And Tarsem talked about in the run-up to the film's release how he was influenced by Renaissance painters, and you can definitely feel that, especially in the big Battle of the Gods and the Titans at the end. It looks like something that could be on the Sistine Chapel, for example. It has a very strong Michelangelo influence on it. And on that level, yeah, it's much better than the clumsy mess that was the Titans films. That looked like they just consulted the designers of God of War and then halfway through forgot any meaningful advice from that. However, it's in other areas where I feel the film almost comes up a little bit shorter than Clash or Wrath. The acting, for one thing, is serviceable, and I'd say maybe there's a little more charisma than there was in either of the Titans films, but that's still not saying much. These are a lot of really great actors here that just don't have much of anything interesting to do or say throughout the runtime, which is a problem with the film's script that I'll go into in a moment. But you've got Henry Cavill, Luke Evans, Mickey Rourke, John Hurt, so many other great people in this cast. Hell, Kellen Lutz might be probably the most charismatic he's ever been in this film, although to be fair, that may be because he gets his balls crushed, but which, for those of you who saw Legend of Hercules, you may find strangely satisfying. Really, the only guy here, or rather the only two people who seem to be the most motivated, are John Hurt, who plays a sort of paternal figure to Theseus, and then of course Mickey Rourke as Hyperion, who clearly is having the time of his life playing this big douchey king. He's just chewing scenery, and well, in some cases he's also eating while doing it, and you can tell he's just having fun with the silly monologues and being sort of this big brooding force of nature. And whenever he's on, the film does pick up momentum a little bit. And of course, whenever John Hurt's on, the film gains a little more legitimacy because it's John Hurt. Do I really need to say more? But everyone else just kind of feels like they're going through the motions. Based on this, you wouldn't really feel much confidence in Henry Cavill becoming Superman, because this film doesn't really capitalize on that charisma. He's got a great deal of energy and likability as an actor, but the film doesn't really capitalize on that. Luke Evans is decent as Zeus, he certainly has the voice for it, but again, the film doesn't give him much in the way of anything interesting to do. And the same can be said for the film's script. It just feels like they took the most basic version of the Theseus and the Minotaur story and then chopped in a few other bits from other Greek myths, and then at the end try to slap on this faux pretentious thing about, oh, look how myths are created, and here's the truth behind all these legends. Like here they sort of do a deconstruction of the Theseus and Minotaur battle, where it's just a guy in a big mask. And on the one hand, yeah, that's kind of a clever idea, but the problem is, one, magic exists in this universe, so this idea doesn't really work. And the fact is, the rest of the film barely does anything with that idea. The rest is just kind of your typical hero's journey story, but really boil down. Like, I, over the years, watching movies, being a cineast, and even reviewing them here on YouTube, have found that there are certain tropes and formulas to these kind of tales. But this is like the most basic first draft version of that you will ever get. There is no flair to any of the characterization. This reads like first draft dialogue, where the scene is just about getting to the end and changing the value. Because if you've ever paid attention in writing class, you know that the function of a scene is that you start somewhere with the characters, and by the end of the scene you end up somewhere else that pushes the plot forward. However, a good writer is supposed to also give us some type of characterization and maybe some kind of dialogue flair and some kind of thematic flair to not make it so painfully obvious. But here, every scene just exists to push the plot forward. We barely get into the characters' heads. The dialogue gives them nothing interesting to say, either profound or funny, which is kind of a problem because then everybody basically becomes a boring sod that you're stuck with outside of Hyperion. And it gives you no reason to get invested, even though the whole kingdom is falling apart and people are dying, and yet you really don't care at all about Theseus and his journey because he's so goddamn boring to be around. I am trying to decide if I dislike him or Worthington's Perseus more, because they're both equally big duds. And I'm tempted to dislike Immortals more because it has that faux pretentious thing going on where it's like, oh, but we also want to deconstruct these myths and show you how they really happened. Yeah, while also trying to do the kind of myths that you're supposed to be deconstructing in the first place. You can't have your cake and eat it too in this case. Pick an idea and stick with it. Trying to do both at the same time doesn't make you look smarter, and it won't mask a generic blockbuster as being a generic blockbuster that has a pretty coat of paint on it. And plus, because of Singh's particular brand of direction, where it's more about the visual composition, this film moves at a slow pace. Among action films, Immortals might be among the slowest burn that I've ever sat through. Scenes feel like they take forever because Singh is moving at such a glacial pace when he moves about with the camera or setting up new shots or directing actors. As a result, every scene feels like it takes forever to get to the point. And that's kind of annoying considering that all these scenes are really only about getting to the point and then moving on. So when you've got a slow-moving movie with nobody that's remotely interesting, where the only novelty is the visual aspect, why do I even need to watch the movie? I could just look at stills from the production on IMDb and I would get a more satisfying experience. Even the music doesn't do anything to salvage it. Trevor Morris I've heard in a few other places and I think is a decent musician. But just like Ramin Djawadi, his score doesn't bring much interesting to the film. It serves, and it's probably less generic than what Ramin Djawadi composed, but it doesn't have anything about it that makes me think ancient Greece. And all of this is so infuriating because you can see Immortals was built on a really interesting idea, and it could have had the potential to go somewhere. It had a great cast, and it had a director who clearly knows how to make something look amazing. Dare I say it, Mirror Mirror was probably a more effective implementation of the whole deconstruction idea, and even then that film still had problems figuring out who it was intended for. But there at least everything was more consistent and you felt like there was more of an endgame. This was trying to be a sort of big, fun, postmodern fairy tale. And while it also had some pacing hiccups and again couldn't quite make up its mind if it was intended for people who were already aware of the fairy tales and wanted to see them poked fun at, or if it was intended to be a proper kids movie, at least there you felt like Tarsem had more of an idea of what he wanted to accomplish. This just feels like a movie that exists to be somewhere between Clash of the Titans and 300, but it doesn't have the edge or the bite of 300, and it doesn't even have just a broad, dumb spectacle that's easy to access like Clash of the Titans, for lack of a better term. This film feels like it's some kind of art school experiment on how to make a big action movie. It never feels comfortable in its own shoes, and as a result, it doesn't make for a very interesting experience. And in the end, really, all three of these films, both Titans and Immortals, just don't amount to much. And really, you're better off with either 300 or even 300 Rise of an Empire if you want to get your fix for Greek-themed actioners. Sure, 300 too may be a little more meat-headed and might not be as well, thoughtful for lack of a better term, or have as many memorable quotes as the first one, but it still delivers on exactly what you want, and it doesn't waste your time with stuff that isn't important. Both Titans and Immortals seem content to just mess around and do nothing of consequence with their premises, and as a result, just left a bitter taste in my mouth.